Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Language Lounge, your weekly space for reflections on language, culture, and how we connect through words. Today, I want to dive into a topic that's been on my mind for a while, the English language. Specifically, how it sounds, how it's spoken by native speakers, and why it's such a fascinating and sometimes confusing language to learn and use. So, whether you're someone who's learning English, a native speaker yourself, or just someone curious about languages in general, let's unpack what makes English, well, English. Let's start with something simple. How does English sound? I mean, if we take a step back and listen to English without focusing on its meaning, what does it actually sound like? To non-native ears, English can be described as a little bouncy, maybe even a bit nasal, depending on the accent. Some people say it has a sort of rhythmic up and down quality. I've heard English described as sounding almost melodic in its own way, even though it's not necessarily musical, like, say, Italian or Portuguese. What's really unique about English is the sheer diversity of accents within it. You can hear the difference between, let's say, the flat, relaxed tones of American English, the clipped, precise sounds of British received pronunciation, or the sing-songy lilt of Irish or Scottish English. Even within these, you've got a whole spectrum. Southern US accents, for instance, can sound entirely different from a New York accent. The range is incredible. Now, when I say native English, I'm talking about the way English is spoken by people who grew up with it. It's worth noting that this doesn't mean just one thing. English as spoken in Australia isn't the same as English as spoken in Canada, South Africa, or India. Even within the same country, native speakers will differ in pronunciation, slang, and expressions. This is one of the reasons English can feel inconsistent or even chaotic to learners. So, what's behind this diversity? A big part of it is history. English, as you probably know, is a bit of a linguistic Frankenstein. It's this mix of Germanic roots, Norman French influence, and a hefty dose of Latin and Greek, among others. The grammar is mostly Germanic, but so much of the vocabulary comes from French. Take the word beef, for example. It comes from the Old French boeuf. But the word for the actual animal, cow, is Germanic. And this pattern is everywhere. This borrowing of vocabulary also makes English incredibly flexible, but it also means there are words that sound completely different but mean almost the same thing. Think of start and commence, or ask and inquire. A lot of learners find this both fascinating and frustrating because you never know which word you'll encounter in daily speech. And let's not forget the sounds of English, those pesky vowels and diphthongs. English is notorious for having a lot of vowel sounds. Depending on the accent, there can be as many as 20 or so distinct vowel sounds in English. Compare that to a language like Spanish, which only has 5 vowel sounds. It's no wonder English is tough for non-native speakers to master. Take the words beat and bit. To a native speaker, these are obviously different. But to someone learning English, the distinction between the vowel sounds, I, and I, can be incredibly subtle. And then there's the dreaded schwa sound, that weak, unstressed vowel that shows up in words like about, sofa, or even banana. It's the most common sound in English, but it's not represented by any particular letter, so it's a real challenge for learners. But here's what I find fascinating. Native speakers don't really think about these sounds at all. They just come naturally. For someone born into an English-speaking household, the rhythm, the stresses, and the melody of English are almost instinctive. Stress and intonation. Speaking of stress, let's talk about how English words and sentences are stressed. This is one of those features that gives English its unique flow and rhythm. For example, in most English sentences, the important words, the nouns, verbs, and adjectives get stressed, while smaller grammatical words like and, the, or is are often reduced. Take this sentence. I want to go to the store. A native speaker doesn't stress every word equally. You'd probably hear it as something like, I want to go to the store. The rhythm is almost like a heartbeat. Da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. That pattern is one of the defining features of English. Now, intonation is another big part of how English is spoken. English speakers tend to use rising intonation for yes or no questions, like when you ask, are you coming? But for statements, we usually have a falling intonation, as in, I'm going to the park. That rise and fall of pitch adds a lot of nuance and emotion to English speech. In fact, sometimes it's not what you say, but how you say it that makes the biggest difference. For example, if I say, oh really, with a rising intonation, it sounds like I'm genuinely curious or surprised. But if I say, oh really, with a flat, falling tone, it sounds sarcastic or dismissive. This kind of subtlety is one of the reasons people say English is hard to master. It's not just the vocabulary or grammar, it's the layers of meaning that come from how you deliver a sentence. Native versus non-native speech. Let's shift gears for a second and talk about how native English differs from non-native English. One of the biggest giveaways of a non-native speaker is the rhythm. Many learners carry over the rhythm of their first language, which might not match English's stress-timed pattern. For instance, in a syllable-timed language like Spanish or French, each syllable gets roughly equal weight. But in English, the timing is more uneven, with stressed syllables spaced out while unstressed ones kind of shrink. If a non-native speaker says, "I'm going to the store," but gives equal weight to every syllable, it sounds very different from how a native would say it. Pronunciation is another big one. A native speaker might swallow sounds or merge words together, what we call connected speech. For example, instead of saying, "What are you doing?" you might hear, "What you doing?" Or, "I'm going to" becomes, "I'm gonna." These shortcuts are so common in spoken English that they can trip up even advanced learners. But it's not just pronunciation, it's also word choice. Native speakers have a knack for choosing casual, idiomatic expressions. Instead of saying, "I am very tired," a native might say, "I'm beat." Or instead of "that's a big problem," they might say, "That's a huge deal." These little shifts in vocabulary and phrasing are part of what gives English its native feel. Why English feels global. Now let's talk about why English has become such a global language. Part of it is historical, British colonialism and later the influence of American media, technology and culture. But another reason is English's adaptability. Because English has borrowed so much vocabulary from other languages, it's remarkably open to incorporating new words and concepts. Think about how quickly English speakers adopt slang, or how new terms from technology, like selfie, hashtag, or streaming, become part of everyday speech almost overnight. This flexibility is both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it makes English dynamic and ever-evolving. On the other hand, it means there's always something new to learn, even for native speakers. Final thoughts. So, where does all this leave us? English is a language of contradictions. It's simple in some ways. Its grammar, for instance, is relatively straightforward compared to languages with complex case systems. But it's also maddeningly complex in other ways with its inconsistent spelling, quirky idioms, and endless variety of accents. If you're learning English, my advice is to focus on its patterns rather than its exceptions. Try to internalize the rhythm and flow of the language and don't get too bogged down by every irregular verb or unusual spelling. And if you're a native speaker, take a moment to appreciate just how intricate and beautiful your language is. Thanks for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. What do you find most fascinating or frustrating about English? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this has been The Language Lounge. Keep exploring, keep connecting, and I'll see you soon.